Howdy, today on Flipping Science we're going to be looking at carbohydrates. So this is what you're going to have to be able to do. So given the structure, determine whether an organic compound is a carbohydrate. Write the molecular formula for glucose and for disaccharides and polysaccharides based on glucose. Identify the repeating unit and draw the structural formula of the monomer, given the structural formula of a polysaccharide derived from one monomer, so basically make polysaccharides from monosaccharides. Explain the ability of glucose to react as an aldehyde when in chain form but not in ring form. And explain the differences in solubility between simple carbohydrates and polysaccharides in terms of size of molecules and hydroxyl groups. So what are carbohydrates? They're a very important molecule because they're a very good energy store for both animals, but they're also an energy store for plants as well. The first thing that you break down basically when you need energy is carbohydrates. You can also get energy from fats and proteins, but you get energy from fats after you've gone through most of your carbohydrate stores in your body. For example, your brain runs pretty much exclusively on glucose. It can use proteins, but only really at a big stretch. So what are carbohydrates? So they're naturally occurring sugars and their polymers. The general formula may be C6H2YOY, so that means they have twice as much hydrogen as they have oxygen and a certain number of carbons. A good example, and one we're going to talk about a lot, is glucose. So glucose's chemical formula is C6H12O6. Another good example, and that's the background here, is sucrose. That's table sugar, that's C12H22O11. The precise definition of what a carbohydrate is it's a polyhydroxyaldehyde or polyhydroxyketone, or a polymer of a polyhydroxyaldehyde or a polyhydroxide ketone. So a nice way to summarize that is polyhydroxyaldehydes or ketones or their polymers. So here's some examples. We can see in this one here we've got an aldehyde group at the end, and in this one here we've got a ketone group. We can join these together and we can make long chains of carbohydrates, so we can make polymers out of these as well. We can classify carbohydrates based on how many ring structures they contain. So normally a monosaccharide has one ring, so mono means one, so one saccharide means sugar, so one sugar. Disaccharides are usually made up of two rings joined together. Well, they are. Di means two, so two rings joined together. Polysaccharides are made up of three or more joined together. Monosaccharides are generally C6H12O6, and when you join two monosaccharides together you get a disaccharide, and the formula there is C12H22O11, assuming that you started with two C6H12O6s. So here's an example. We've got glucose and we're reacting it with glucose and we're making maltose, and we get a small molecule coming out as water. So this is a condensation reaction. You can see where they're joining down here at this OH group that's shared by this glucose and glucose. So when they join together, we get a COC bond, and then we get a water molecule coming out. So here's a general equation for that. So 2C6H12O6 goes to C12H22O11 plus water. A good example of a polysaccharide is starch. So that's an energy storage molecule that's used in plants. It's made up of lots of glucose monomers joined together at a particular point. We're going to look at cellulose as well. It's similar in structure, but it's just where the glucose is joined together is slightly different. So our chemical formula for a polysaccharide following this pattern with glucose is C6H10O5 to the N, and N can be any number, like I said, for a polysaccharide above 2. So it could be 3, could be hundreds, could be thousands. So here's a reaction equation showing what's happening when we're going to make a polysaccharide. So here, for example, we've got two glucoses joined together to make maltose. We're adding in another glucose, and then we have now three glucoses joined together, and we get a water molecule. Then we add on another glucose, we get another water molecule coming out, then we get another glucose attached, and that happens, and so on and so on and so on. Now, glucose can do some interesting things. It can exist in two forms in solution. So if you shove it in water, it will exist in both of these forms in an equilibrium. If we look at the chain form, this is called the chain form because it's a long chain, you can see at the end of it, it's got an aldehyde group, so C double bond OH. If we look at the ring form, we can see there's no aldehyde group anymore. If you put these in solution, you get an equilibrium, mostly ring form, occasionally chain form. And what that means is that the chain form can react as an aldehyde. And what this means is if it's an aldehyde, then you can oxidize it through to a carboxylic acid. And that's one way of, say, for testing for glucose, for example. You can use glucose as an aldehyde, oxidize it through to a carboxylic acid. And then you can react the carboxylic acid if you like. This only happens when the glucose is in the chain form, not when it's in the ring form, because it doesn't have the aldehyde group anymore. Now we're going to look at the solubility differences between simple sugars and big polysaccharides. If we have a look at glucose, the structure here, we can see we've got lots of hydroxyl groups. And what that means is that glucose is very, very soluble in water. Each of these hydroxyl groups, as well as this oxygen here, and this hydroxyl group over here as well, they can form hydrogen bonds with water. And what that means is they can get in between the water molecules and they'll dissolve in the water. It's also a fairly small molecule. There are 6 carbons in there, but because they're surrounded by all these hydroxyl groups, that makes it very, very soluble. Whereas if you have polysaccharides that are really, really long, that makes them less soluble. There's a few reasons for that. One reason here is that they have fewer hydroxyl groups exposed per monomer. What that means is as the chain gets longer, you have a long carbon chain, and you don't have as many hydroxyl groups that are there necessarily to separate out, to dissolve in with the water and make bonds with the water. If we look at some examples, so starch and cellulose, I'll show you their structures in a second. Starch is just soluble in water, not very soluble in water, and cellulose is basically insoluble in water. It doesn't dissolve in water. If cellulose was soluble in water, then trees would dissolve because the cell walls of plants are made up of cellulose. Another reason why they don't dissolve in water if they're really, really big is because they hydrogen bond with each other as well. So you can get long cellulose molecules hydrogen bonding with other cellulose molecules, and in that case the water just can't make it in between. So if we have a look at the structures, we can kind of get an idea of that. So down here we'll have a look at the structures of starch and cellulose. We can see as they get longer, we're losing a hydroxyl group that would have been there, we're losing a hydroxyl group that would have been over here, so we're getting less and less hydroxyl groups exposed per ring unit. We can see the difference in structure between cellulose and starch, where the hydroxyl groups join together is slightly different in between them. So we get less hydroxyl groups, and they're going to be able to bond with the water, hydrogen bond with the water less as the molecule gets bigger. The other reason, like I said up here, there's going to be lots of hydrogen bonding between the chains of cellulose or starch, for example, by themselves. And when we're trying to get water molecules in between here, we have to basically break the hydrogen bonds between the strands between the polymer strands, and then insert water molecules in between them. And that's very, very difficult to do. So another section of this student outline talks about hydrolysis of polysaccharides and the production of ethanol from glucose. So let's have a look at that. So making alcohol from sugars is called fermentation, and there's a few steps to it. First, you usually start with something that has a lot of glucose rings in it, so starch for example, and you hydrolyze that to monosaccharides. So that's this first equation here. So here we have starch, lots and lots of glucose rings joined together. We're hydrolyzing by putting in water and we're producing glucose. Here I've also got disaccharides doing the same thing, so hydrolyzing a disaccharide to produce glucose. We use yeast to do this. It's a fungus, and it can both hydrolyze and then produce the ethanol from the glucose. So here's got glucose, we do the fermentation, we produce the ethanol and carbon dioxide. And here's a little experiment showing that. We can see the bubbles in the yeasty mix. Here's a guy looking in a still. So this is how we make alcohol for our drinking. Conditions for fermentation. You need it between a temperature of between 20 and 30 degrees. If it's any hotter than that, you start to kill off the yeast and also denature the enzymes that are doing the process. So the yeast carry enzymes that are doing all those processes, the hydrolysis and the fermentation. It's an exothermic process, fermentation, so you're releasing energy, so you might need to cool down your reaction vessel. It's also anaerobic. If you have too much oxygen in there, you won't produce ethanol, you'll produce ethanoic acid. So you get too much oxygen going in, you oxidize the ethanol to ethanal, then ethanoic acid, which is how vinegar is made. So you want pretty much no oxygen. You do need a very, very small amount so that the yeast can reproduce and grow. Also, another reaction condition is the presence of yeast. If you don't have yeast, fermentation won't really happen. So let's look at some example questions. So it says, this one here, starch is a major component of potatoes. Structural formula of starch is shown below. Under certain storage conditions, starch breaks down into glucose. Draw the structural formula of 1-glucose. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to draw in my bracket so I know what repeating unit I'm aiming for to get. And that will also tell me where I need to put in my hydrogens so that I can make my glucose. So here's our repeating unit. So I'm going to start by basically copying the structure that I already have. So I've got CH2OH up here. I'm going to an oxygen, down, down, cross, cross, up. So I've got my hexagon shape there. I'm going to shove on my H's, and now down here where this O is, there needs to be another hydrogen next to it. So putting OH, so we've got OH here, H there, OH there, H there. Now here I'm going to go up H. Down here again I want my oxygen and I want to have a hydrogen as well. And I've only got one more H I think to put in here. Alright, and there's a picture of glucose. So I'm using the picture here to help me to figure out what the structure is going to be. So here's another question. It says cotton is composed of the carbohydrate cellulose. Structural formula is shown there. State one reason why cellulose is insoluble in water. So there's a few ways you could look at this. You could say that the molecule is very long, so it's a long carbon chain with few opportunities for hydrogen bonding between water and the cellulose structure. And that means that will make it insoluble in water. Another way of looking at it is that there will be extensive hydrogen bonding between the cellulose polymer strands, and to dissolve in water you would need to break those hydrogen bonds between the strands and get water remaking those hydrogen bonds essentially. And that would be very difficult to do. Next bit says, in nature cellulose can be hydrolyzed to form glucose. Write an equation for this hydrolysis. So we need to start with our general formula for a polysaccharide that's based on glucose. So we had it before, C6H10O5 to the N. Now we're hydrolyzing it. If we're hydrolyzing it, that means we're adding in water. Now the number of waters we need to add is going to be N. And then that's going to go to glucose. So we're told it's making glucose, so C6H12O6. And the number of those we get is N again. So we've got N amounts of the ring structures, so C6H10O5, so we've got N of these up here. We have to add in N water molecules to break them up, and from that we get N number of C6H12O6, N number of glucoses out of it. The last part of the question says, explain why cellulose is classified as a carbohydrate. So if we look back at the structure of cellulose, we can see in terms of its structure, it's a polymer of glucose, and glucose itself is a polyhydroxyaldehyde or a polyhydroxide ketone. They're the words that we need to remember when we do this. So the way I would say it is cellulose is a polymer of polyhydroxyaldehyde. So that's it for our carbohydrates today. We looked at the general structure of a carbohydrate, we looked at the types of carbohydrates, we looked at their solubility, we talked about the ring and the chain structure of glucose, and we answered some questions, simple questions on carbohydrates. That's it for Flippin Science today. See ya.